Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator, Karl Cassell. As we have come to a critical moment in our political livelihood as a nation, questions, scenarios, and adjustments are being suggested that would guarantee our democracy continues to operate efficiently for all of its citizens in the voting process, before and after. We want to discuss if a two-party system can still be adequately represented in our society for the greater population of the citizens in this country. Today we have three panelists that are going to help us discuss this issue. To my immediate left, we have James Lynch, politics and investigative reporter from the Gazette. Good morning.
Good morning, Karl.
And in the middle, we have Myra Matejka, co-chair of the Libertarian Party of Iowa. Good morning.
Good morning, thank you.
And on the end, we have Timothy Hagle, professor of political science at the University of Iowa. Good morning.
Morning.
So as we deal with a two-party system, or it still being adequate for where we are as a nation in the future, let's first start out with the four fundamentals of political parties, if someone wants to address that topic.
Well, I'll leave a textbook definition to Professor Hagle, but practically speaking, from what I see, the political parties raise money and try to elect candidates to gain control of whatever the legislative body, Congress, whatever body we're talking about. That seems to be their primary functions today. Historically, I'm sure that's changed over the course of history, but today it's raise money, elect candidates.
Okay. Anyone else?
Well, just I guess to add to that is you mentioned that that's the way it is today. And I think that part of the question that we're asking here about whether the two-party system is still adequate or appropriate or satisfying is, are they satisfying another function, which would be to group together for policy goals, which could be to enact legislation or other sorts of policies. And that's the part that at least has fallen by the wayside to a certain extent. And that gets into things like, well, what about the platform? Is it still valid? Why do you still have it? Do the candidates even read it sometimes? And the answer to that is often no. And so that's maybe the part that's getting people a little unhappy with the two-party system, is that they're maybe not representing policies the same way that they had, at least some had in the past.
It also seems to me that because Congress is kind of what we look at, and they don't seem to get anything done, whether it's Democratic control or Republican control. And I think that's part of the frustration that sort of gives rise to the question of, are the two parties adequate? Because as far as the policy that Professor Hagle was talking about, they don't seem to be enacting a lot of policy. It's, there's drama and a lot of rhetoric, but not a lot of policy.
Mm-hmm.
But some people would say that maybe that's a good thing, that they don't enact a lot of policy.
Sure. That's one thing that I was saying earlier, was that part of the fundamentals of a political party is to control the government. Mm-hmm. Well, libertarians think about controlling the government in a different way than the Republicans and the Democrats might. They want to control policy, and they want to be able to control the economic system, and they want to be able to control the body of the the constituents. Whereas the Libertarian Party wants to actually control the government and restrict it and make sure that it's running the way that it should be and that we're doing the things that we should be doing.
And so you are a libertarian, so talk to us a little bit about that party. What are the platforms, and is it viable in the two-party system?
Sure,
currently?
It absolutely is viable. We just received major party status this year in Iowa, thanks to the Gary Johnson campaign. It's been a struggle to flip from, to a political party from a philosophy club, basically. It's going to work. We have a very strong foundation of activists in the state. We tend to hear a lot about the Green Party in Iowa, that they received major party status as well. it didn't work for them very well because they didn't have an infrastructure. They kind of just followed one person, one candidate, and that's what blew them up. They didn't have the activists and the foundation set, whereas we've been working for 50 years. We have the team set aside. We have a very, very strong foundation. I don't think we're going to go anywhere very soon. So.
Go ahead.
Well, I think it's important or significant that the Libertarian Party has gained major party ballot status. So your candidates, you have governor candidate and some legislative candidates and some of the statewide offices this year, which is a significant step forward for the party, for any party that's trying to grow and establish itself.
Absolutely.
And some of those people have been very, I've known them for a long time. They've been active in the Libertarian Party, so
Sure.
like you say, the foundation is there.
Very good.
I was just going to say that it's interesting. You mentioned the Green Party, which of course got status in Iowa. You have to get a certain number of votes in a general election to do it, then you get that status. And so now the people that are filling out their voter registration forms for the first time now can choose Libertarian as well as Democrat, Republican, or no party. But you also then, of course, have to get that percentage vote this time around. In the midterm elections, we know that turnout is down. And so that means that you have to have candidates that are strong enough at the gubernatorial level to be able to pull enough voters and get them to vote for that candidate in order to maintain that status. And so that's going to be an interesting question as to whether that happens. Otherwise, you'll end up being relegated back to that non-party political organization status.
Right, and to add on to that, you've been able to register as Libertarian for a few years now, even though we weren't a major party. We're the only party in the state that's growing. We grew by 5% just last month, and we haven't received our numbers coming into the primary. So I'm assuming that more people registered for the primary as well. So the other parties are declining, and we're the only one that's continuing to grow. So
Let's dig a little deeper. You talk about the other two parties on the decline or either stagnant, and the Libertarian Party growing. Why? I could guess a few reasons why, but I would love to hear the perspective of each one of you.
Well, I find it very interesting because, you look at the 2016 presidential election, there was so much activity, so much enthusiasm on both sides, but the numbers have been going down slightly, not by huge amounts, but even after the caucuses this year, the numbers are down again. I haven't seen what happened in terms of primary registration. We'll have to wait until next month to see those numbers, and it may be bouncing up. But as Tim said, the midterms generally participation is lower, but it surprises me that in the wake of the 2016 election, with the resistance that we've seen, that those numbers haven't stayed up.
One thing about the numbers, and unfortunately this is one of the things I do every month, check the numbers, and I've got my little database and go through all this stuff, is that there's an ebb and flow to all of this. That obviously the caucuses will usually generate a lot of new registrations in presidential years, obviously not in midterm years. And then, of course, as you head into primaries and general elections, regardless of whether it's a midterm presidential, then you have a spike in registrations. And then after that, they go through a period of adjustments where the county auditors will go through and basically take off people who have no longer voted or moved or died, whatever it is. And so that's why there tends to be a dip. And I think that's partly the reason why you see maybe some decrease on certain months from Democrats and Republicans, but I've also seen the gains as well. But one of the things that's been pretty consistent is that the no party registrations have been increasing much more than Democrats and Republicans. And so to whatever extent Libertarians are, although at this point with something like 2.1 million registered voters in the state, there are 10,000, just a little over 10,000 registered Libertarians. Now that may jump a little bit because of the primary, but that's still a pretty low number.
Sure.
Whereas with the other parties, it's much higher. And of course, no party voters outnumber either Democrats or Republicans in the state.
Sure, and to kind of speak to that a little bit, when I started with the party 5 years ago, we had 2,000 registered voters. So the fact that we have We have almost 11,000 now. I'm guessing after the primary. I think part of your question was why? Why are the other parties declining, and why is there a draw to the Libertarian Party? I think it has to do with the fact that the Libertarian Party it's called the Party of Principle for a reason. There's a platform. It hasn't changed very much in the last 50 years. It's all centered around the same basic principles, and our candidates follow those principles. And when you have the Republicans and the Democrats, they, like you said, they probably don't even know what their platform is. So I think that makes it difficult when you're voting for a candidate and you want them to follow this platform, and then they turn around and they don't provide that for them.
Do you get any sense, Myra, where your growth is coming from? I mean, are those people just affected Republicans and Democrats, or are they new voters?
We
Young
actually,
voters?
yeah, we actually pull from all sides. A lot of people assume that we pull from the Republican Party the most. We actually get a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters because of our foreign policy, platform and our non-aggression platform. So it's coming from both, social-minded liberals who care about things that nobody's talking about, like criminal justice, social issues like with police brutality and stuff like that. And then we also have the Republicans that care about fiscal conservatives and managing the budget in a fiscally responsible way. So.
Good. So let me ask a question that kind of deals with the two parties and their platform. So historically, the two major parties have had stances on few major social issues that at times differentiate them from one another. Are these platforms a thing of the past?
Well, the platforms certainly aren't a thing of the past. They do exist. The question, just saying, is how much do the candidates follow them? And part of the problem, if you want to call it that, is that the platforms, and this is actually a good thing, is that they are built from the ground up, that they start in the caucuses, that people in precincts can bring in planks that they say, I want this policy, or I want the party to follow this policy. They vote on it in the precinct level, and then it goes up to the county level, and the district, and the state, and the national. So it goes through a lot of changes as it works its way up, but sometimes at whatever level you're talking about, there are planks in there that maybe some candidates don't agree with or think would be a hindrance to their being able to be elected, or different policy position from what they've taken in the past. And so we've sometimes seen even presidential candidates say, well, I haven't read it, so I don't know what's in it. So that way it avoids having to defend some plank that they think is going to be detrimental to their electoral chances. So in that sense, it sort of defeats the whole purpose of having that grassroots input into something that then isn't going to be followed. Now, of course, there are good reasons, electoral reasons, to not follow it, but that again defeats that grassroots participation, feeling that your party is actually adhering to whatever those principles are. And again, given, especially at the presidential level, the size and scope of the campaigns, it's very difficult then to get that grassroots input, so it's really no surprise.
Well, and we see regional differences too. I mean, between, if you look at the Republican Party, Northeastern Republicans are much different than, say, Midwestern Republicans or Western Republicans. And you see, and you see some of those same differences in the Democratic Party, where there are regional differences. The Iowa Republicans' concern about the RFS and ethanol and those sorts of things aren't shared by Republicans in Texas, for example. So sometimes putting that platform together is pretty hard, and once you get it enacted, people in Texas may say, a candidate in Texas may say, forget that stuff. I'm not standing up for RFS and ethanol. So you see, that's part of the problem with the platforms, especially on a national basis.
I think at the same time, you always have those one-issue voters, too, where maybe they don't agree with the entire or even any of the Republican stances, but they don't want abortion, or they feel very strongly about one specific issue. And so they just pull all of their weight, they toe that party line no matter what. They could do really, really bad things, and they wouldn't care as long as they had their stance on certain issues.
Right. Well, and we've seen, the rise of sort of the outside influences of abortion rights and abortion opponents on the parties as they raise money, recruit candidates. Gun rights, supporters and opponents, the same thing. They have, a lot of influence on the parties. So, that affects who comes to the party, you might say, and sort of the direction the party goes. But I think it's a question of, who's leading the parade? Are the interest groups leading the parade, or is the party still in control and setting the direction? And I think, that's probably another half-hour debate.
So we all remember 25 years ago, about 25 years ago, Ross Perot, and presidential candidate, had a place on the stage with the other two candidates. Do we see third parties at some level in the future getting that sort of recognition and stance again anytime soon? And if so, why? And would it be the Libertarian Party or potentially another party? It's for anyone.
Well, I think in Ross Perot's case, he really didn't have a party at all. I mean, he was sort of a one-man force,
Yep.
but he got the support to get there. I think we may see a third person on the stage for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of talk about, whether or not it should just be two major parties debating in these presidential debates, or whether there should be other voices, and you get into the whole fairness, and some of the groups that sponsor those are kind of examining, whether or not they need to be more inclusive. But then beyond that, I think it's just a matter of, whether a candidate can generate the interest and support to get there, like Ross Perot did. Gary Johnson, a lot of people thought he should be on the stage, that he had the support, that he should have been there. But it's very hard. I mean, it's going to be hard for a Libertarian or a Green Party or whoever to get there, just because the two-party system is
Sure.
Monopoly.
I'll tell
Yeah.
you some of the struggles that we had, especially with Gary Johnson and being allowed to debate. The stations, the media will say, you have to poll a certain number. But if your name's not even included in the poll, it makes it really,
Yeah.
really hard to
Yeah.
to pull that percentage. So there's a lot of tricks and there's a lot of games. They say things like you have to raise a certain amount of dollars. Well, what's that mean? I mean, does my dollars support whether or not I get to have a conversation like this with the other candidates? So.
To some extent, it almost reminds me of what we see here in the caucuses. And one of the values of the caucuses is that somebody that doesn't have name recognition, doesn't have a lot of money, can, for example, get in a pickup truck and go around the state and build that support until he or she, the person I'm thinking of is Rick Santorum, can get enough support to basically then earn a place on the stage. I have mixed feelings about this. I kind of lean to say, yeah, it would have been nice to maybe had Gary Johnson in some of those debates to sort of have a different point of view, particularly given the last election where a lot of people didn't like either of the two major party candidates. But where do you draw the line? Because there are going to be some candidates that clearly are not viable in the sense that there's no chance of winning. And I can remember from a few years ago, I'm not sure exactly the year, in the New York governor's race, where, if you remember, the rent is too darn high, clean that up guy. He had it was entertaining, but he had no business being on the stage with Cuomo, somebody who was a legitimate first-tier candidate. I mean, yeah, the entertainment value was great, but at a certain point you have to draw the line and say, well, how many people are we going to get? And that's where you have to have things like a percentage of support in the polls, although it's a legitimate thing, saying, well, look, if you're not even being asked if this person gets your support, how can they get into the polls? Or money or something. You've got to have some criteria in place to say these people are legitimate, can have a place on that stage, because they're somewhat limited in terms of spacing, and we saw that in the last Republican nomination where, I mean, you can't start out with 17 candidates and make a reasonable debate kind of thing. You got to cut it down to whatever it was, 6 or 7 that they had, sort of the first rung, versus the people that aren't going to be there.
Well, and I think in Gary Johnson's case, the fact he worked hard to get on the ballot in all 50 states. I think that criteria alone shows that he was willing to overcome a lot of the ballot access laws in a lot of the states.
So let me push back a little bit. You brought up the money piece, and you bring up there's entertainment value, but are they really a viable candidate? In what we have as a democracy, if someone has the opportunity to have anyone vote for them, wouldn't that make them a viable candidate? And as we look back and see Ross Perot, he was a billionaire. We saw what happened in the '08 and then the '12 elections. So by the time we get to 2016, you have someone who is a former Secretary of State, First Lady, Senator, and a billionaire. So are we creating a system, a political machine that causes people to only have, or to be viable if they have the financial wherewithal? And is that dangerous for our republic?
Probably yes and yes. I mean, I think that's where we're at today, and yeah, it probably is dangerous for the democracy if that's the criteria for being on the stage and being a viable candidate, if money is what determines that.
Right.
Money is a measuring stick, you know, in terms of if you can't raise any money, you probably don't have any support.
Right.
But it shouldn't be the only measuring stick.
Right.
But it's definitely one.
Anyone else?
I agree.
Again, mixed feelings on this to a certain extent. You certainly don't want to have it where it's just money kind of a thing, but to a certain extent, yes, money is a proxy for support. And then, of course, we get into arguments about campaign financing and how much they can give and who can give and that kind of thing. And we have a variety of rules on that. Some people would have us have more rules. Some people would have us have less. But again, it's a question of we're a huge country, 300 plus million, and that means that you have to get your name out there. If you have any chance, and that's what I mean by viability, is that if you have any chance of actually winning or having a good showing, then it's going to take money because this is a big country. And especially if you're talking about big markets on the coast, the New York and Los Angeles and a lot of other places that are very expensive to run any kind of ads, you certainly can't go out and do the kinds of things that we expect presidential candidates to do here in Iowa, where they're showing up at little events and talking to handfuls of people. And by the time the caucuses roll around, they've got to have a organization in place that's pretty good size, because they're going to be hitting a lot of primaries very quickly, and that takes money, that takes organization, which also takes money. And so that's the way it is. Again, you don't want to have that to be the be all and end all, but again, it's often a proxy for how much support a person is going to have.
So could there be the process of starting at a local and a county and maybe even a state level to grow the parties before they get to a national stage, in order for a party to generate that support locally, so then they potentially, out of the 50 states, they would have a national politician at some level. If they can't even get into the game, will they ever get into the game?
And that's really the way to do it, because at those local elections, whether it's a city council, a county board of supervisors, or even sometimes state legislative offices, that's where a third-party candidate actually has more of a chance, even aside from nonpartisan elections. But you don't have to have as much money, you don't have to have as big an organization, and by getting people elected in those smaller, not smaller to saying they're necessarily unimportant, but the smaller electoral types of situations, that you grow that party and you can sort of that support, so that then when you have the nominee at the next level, that you have a better shot.
I'm kind of curious about whether or not a third party will sort of rise up and become, we'll have a three-party system, or whether the two parties will sort of become factionalized. I mean, if you look at the Democrats and the Republicans, there are some real major differences in those parties. I mean, in 2016, it was the Clintonistas and the Bernie-crats, and in the Republican Party, you have, Trump and never Trumps.
Right.
But I mean, I wonder if those differences will grow to the point where we'll see some, social Democrats and progressive Democrats and sort of the Christian Republicans and the, non-secular Republicans,
Right.
if that will ever become, be parties or that split will ever happen.
Well, the split already has happened. I mean, aside from, you know, we were talking about, you were mentioning before about how some people think that the Libertarians kind of pull off from the Republicans, and they do to some extent, but you were saying from the Democrats too. But within the parties, we do have those splits right now. I don't know that they would ever become so much that they would form separate parties necessarily, although there was the Bull Moose Party back in the early 1900s. That's sort of an odd situation. I think when I was thinking about this before we came in, it seemed to me that the parties are always somewhat changing, that they change with the times, they change with the issues, and people change too, that sometimes people, they were Democrats, now they're Republicans, they were Republicans, now they're Democrats, and one of the things I've seen in voter registration is that over the course of time, students, young people, about half of them when they register as no party. But by the time you get into the 65 and up group, it's a very small percentage of no party, because at some point the people make a choice. Right. Now they may not stick with that choice forever, but they eventually make a choice. They find what sort of one party or the other. They may not be entirely comfortable with that party, but for the most part it suits their purposes. Or if they're a one-issue candidate, they may say, okay, gun rights, abortion, whatever it happens to be.
Well, I think a lot of that too has to do with the fact that as you get older, if you're more politically active, you've probably registered to, you know, be active in the caucuses or the primaries too. Whereas a young person probably doesn't know where to even begin with how to do that.
We try to tell them.
Yeah.
As you should. And really quickly, because we only have a couple minutes left, you talked about there could be a shift in the parties. There's already somewhat of a split, but if they're both still Democrat and Republican at the end of the day, is that good for our republic?
So far, I would say it's worked. We can argue about how well it's worked, but it's given stability to the political process and to governing. Is there a better way? Probably.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to say that, you know, our founding fathers warned us about the two-party system.
Certainly.
They said it was politically evil. Thomas Jefferson actually said that if we ended up with two parties, one would be authoritarian, the other one would be trying to rein in the government, and those would keep the government in check. Unfortunately, what we're seeing right now, as far as I'm seeing, is that both the Republicans and the Democrats are authoritarian, and nobody's trying to rein in the government. So we need one of those parties.
I'm happy with the two-party system. You know, I see what happens in Europe sometimes with the very factionalized sorts of very narrow, but the thing I like about the two-party system is that it has sort of a big tent, and at different times each of the two parties has labeled itself as a big tent party because they're trying to bring people together.
Okay.
Not always successfully, but
But that's their job to try. Well, I have a kind of a quote to end our time today, and it's a quote by Lisa Jane Dish from 2002. Herein lies the central tension of the two-party doctrine. It identifies popular sovereignty with choice and then limits choice to one party or the other. If there is any truth to Schadenschneider's analogy between elections and markets, America's faith in the two-party system begs the following question: why do voters accept as the ultimate in political freedom a binary option they would surely protest as consumers? This, in the tyranny of the two-party system, the construct that persuades United States citizens to accept two-party contests as a condition of electoral democracy. Good morning, and thank you.